Hey everybody, it is Thorn. Good morning. I'm very excited because my second book, The Witch's Path, is coming out September 8th. It's actually shipping right now though, so if you've pre-ordered, it may very well be on its way to you. If you have not pre-ordered, please think about doing so. A lot of what I'm going to say in this video is at least touched on in this book, if not gone into in depth. There's a lot in here about next steps. So this video in particular is relevant. If you enjoy the video, think about checking out the book. So this is in response to a friend on Instagram who asked me, they said, I don't know if this is a dumb question or not, but how do you know when you're not a beginner anymore? And that is not a dumb question at all. That's a really smart question. And I think it's one that we don't always ask explicitly. So I thought, well, let's talk about it. So first, I think it's really important as a practitioner of witchcraft, the occult, paganism, magic, whatever your brand of practice is. I think it's really important to acknowledge that it's made up of multiple facets. It's not just one thing. So when we're talking about a beginner versus an advanced practitioner, we have to really sit down and think about what exactly it is we're talking about. Because witchcraft in particular, there's not like it's one thing. It's not a singular discipline. It makes up multiple perspectives. It makes up multiple practices. If we're talking about something like magic, well, what are you a beginner at? Are you a beginner at working with herbs or casting spells or research or working with spirits or communicating with the dead or having a devotional practice to a god, etc. Like a practice of witchcraft potentially includes all of those things, some of those things, and lots of things that I didn't just rattle off the top of my head just now. So I think we need to give ourselves some credit and be a little bit more specific about what we mean, because most of us are going to be beginners in some places and not in others. You're going to have proclivities for some things and not others. Some things are going to be challenging, other things are going to feel like they come naturally to you. And I think it's just a question of maintaining an awareness of those things. It's not that you are totally like a baby witch who knows nothing. If you've watched some of my other videos, you know that even if you're brand new to witchcraft, you're still not brand new to being alive or using discernment or reading and research, right? Like there are lots of things at your disposal that I think often get overlooked because we're so overwhelmed by newness and feeling like a beginner. So don't do that. Ask yourself what resources and what knowledge you already have. So just wanted to kind of throw that out there. I don't think that any of us are just objectively rank beginners with nothing to offer and no knowledge and no opinions and no nothing, right? Or they're advanced and they're adepts. Like there's lots of stuff in between, and most of us are a combination of all of these things depending on what specifically we're talking about. So that thing, first things first. On a more practical note, how do you know when you're ready to take next steps, or when you've moved out of that beginner phase kind of overall? And in thinking about this, I find that music makes for a very useful analogy. I use a lot of music analogies just because I'm a musician too. And I think about, in music, one of the ways that we can distinguish between somebody who's totally new and not confident on an instrument versus somebody who is taking next steps, building proficiency, is improvisation. So thinking about the guitar, right? Like if you have any experience playing guitar, and this applies to a bunch of instruments, you spend a lot of time like getting your fingers strong enough, learning some chords. Eventually you learn some scales, you memorize scales, you get comfortable playing them with different fingerings, etc. And the whole point of doing that is ultimately to be able to improvise, to use those scales to make music, to use those chords to make music. Not just learning somebody else's songs, which is great, but ultimately having the tools in your toolbox to make your own songs if you want to. Witchcraft and magic work very similarly. When you find yourself in a place where you realize that you are improvising your ritual work and your spell crafting. Not because that necessarily needs to be your goal. My particular brand of witchcraft tends to be very ceremonial. So I've got a lot of kind of like forms and styles in my own toolbox that are really not improvised at all. They're kind of, they're foundational, and I sort of riff on them to keep that music analogy going. But it's not the same as being like a folk witch who can pull from everything around them all the time and is doing that really actively, like whatever kind of witchcraft you're practicing. But all of us run into situations where we're not operating like in ideal spaces. We either like don't have the time that we need to do what we would do. We don't have all of the supplies that we would want to do X thing. We don't necessarily have a ritual or a spell or whatever pre-prepared for whatever that thing is that just happened to us or that we need it for. Right, or we have something in books maybe that, like if you've got like big spell books or ritual books or whatever, and you find that, wow, this has an awful lot of stuff to do if X thing happens, but what about Y thing? Like it's kind of like X, but it's a little bit different. When you realize that you are starting there and then improvising on that, to me that's a sign of somebody who is advancing, who's taking next steps. You don't have X herb, but you know your correspondences, so you can pull from something else. You don't know what's going on in this book about this particular kind of magic, blah, 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 but you can draw an analogy to something that happens in your own locale, something in your region, right? Maybe you are replacing particular kinds of supplies like crystals or herbs or whatever in spells and using things that are native to your biome, right? I think those are all signs of an advancing practitioner. Somebody who can take something pre-written or something that they already know and then riff on it to accomplish something else and be successful. That to me is an advancing skill. The other thing that I wanted to say too is that as you, I think, progress past the beginner stage, one of the things that makes somebody clearly a more advanced practitioner is when they're speaking about witchcraft, increasingly they are speaking from their personal experience. They're not just saying, well, yes, this thing is true because I read it in this book, or I heard this on TikTok, or I saw a reel on Instagram, or I saw an info post or whatever, or a friend told me. Instead, you're able to go, yes, I've tried that before, and this is what happened when I did it. Or yes, I've done that ritual before, or I've had this relationship with this deity, or whatever it is. When you find that you are speaking from your own well of experience rather than just reciting something that you got from another source, that's another sign that you've moved past the beginner stage. So those are just some quick kind of basic things, but I want to emphasize that very first thing that I said, which is that most of us aren't beginners at all things, or advanced in all areas equally. Generally speaking, we're a mix, right? You could be a total beginner at casting spells, but maybe you have a theater background and you're a gifted ritualist. You're able to draw on those experiences that you had in community theater or whatever, right? Like everybody has proclivities, talents, if you want to call them, okay, that lend themselves to being good at some things and probably less good at other things. That's true about all of us. So when you're trying to self-evaluate, I would say keep those kinds of things in mind. You might be totally new to witchcraft, but maybe you've got a scholarly background or you're really good at research or whatever, so you just kind of already have a system in place for how you're going to learn something, right? Like all of that stuff leads to advancing practice. So ask yourself specifically, what am I a beginner at? Or what am I trying to become advanced in? Because you could just say witchcraft or magic or occultism, but those are massive categories. So try to narrow it down. I think that will make things a little bit easier, and it will also build confidence. So there's that. I'm super excited about this book as I knock my camera. Please check it out on Amazon or Llewellyn. It is specifically about taking next steps, and it's not just for beginners. It's beginner friendly, but it's also for folks dealing with burnout. It's for community leaders and coven leaders who are feeling a little bit weather worn, and it's also for armchair witches, people who maybe know a lot but need some encouragement in putting things to practice. So have a good day.